We hear a lot of perspectives on the Mankind podcast. Inclusion of a guest is not an endorsement of their views, and the opinions expressed here do not always represent the mission or values of the Mankind Project USA.
Looks like the rain has gone.
Welcome to the Mankind Podcast, the show where men come together, take their masks off, have real conversations, and really just get away from the media's magnifying glass. You know, men have really been on blast for the past couple years, and you know what? Many of the reasons why are justified. However, what it's causing for the greater populace of men in this world is to really doubt and question their place, their efficacy, and how we as men can be part of solutions and not problems. And so what we do here on the show is we call men in to tough conversations. We don't call them out. We don't subject them to inquiry, but instead inquire internally as to how we as men can become better fathers, sons, citizens, partners. You get the idea. And so if this is your first time joining us, welcome. And you are going to love today's episode. Now, we are joined today by David Quint, who is a filmmaker out of Colorado who has produced a documentary which has probably caused more tears to fall from my face than The Lion King, right? Let me tell you about it. So, haunted by the story of an abandoned boy, David sets out with his estranged father on a high-stakes trip to an orphanage in Switzerland. Now, while they're there, they're unlocking secrets surrounding his father's missing father himself, and these men uncover a stunning truth that transforms their lives. Now, this story truly is uplifting and was completely captured while it was happening. So between all the gripping twists and turns, the immediacy and emotion, the heartfelt realizations and the connection between father and son as they go on to discover this father's lost history, I'm telling you, this documentary is compelling, it's gripping, and it's a beautiful story of how a son and his father grow to learn more about one another and build their love in their relationship, where many people would say that there really was no chance of that happening. So what I want you to prepare yourself for as we dive into this episode with David Quint and his documentary, Father Unknown, I want you to inquire in yourself, how is your relationship with your father? Perhaps maybe not your father, but the male role models in your life that have taught you from a young age what the world is all about. And perhaps by looking up, by inquiring into the generations that have gone before us, we can have a better understanding as to why we are the way we are, why we behave the way we behave. If this episode is proof of anything, it's proof that through healing the wounds of generations past, we in turn can heal ourselves. So step up, grip in, hang on. This interview is going to be a lot of fun and a really deep dive into a beautiful story between David and his father. Enjoy. G'day, and welcome to another live recording of the Mankind Podcast, the show where we break the molds of modern manhood to prove there is more than just one way to be a man. I'm your host, Clift, and today we are joined by filmmaker David Quint, who in his latest film, Father Unknown, we get to follow him and his father on a journey to Switzerland so that he can help his father find out his origins and where he's from. Mate, powerful movie. My homework was to watch it before we did this interview, and mate, tears in my eyes all throughout. Such a touching story. So before we get into the movie though, tell us a little bit about yourself and we'll get underway.
My name is David Quint. I live in Denver, Colorado, and I'm a filmmaker. I've done, quite a bit over the years in the film industry. I've shot television commercials, music videos, TV shows. But Father Unknown really emerged as kind of an accident and not a film I ever intended to make, or really did I even think I was making a film at all while it was occurring. In fact, it was recorded on a camera phone. So um, it's a bit of a surprise, not only in terms of what happens, but the way in which it happened and the way in which it turned into a film.
A surprise indeed, mate. I tell you what, we were chatting before we went live, and you mentioned the journey you took with your father was, although the documentary tells a really touching story, right, of your father basically opening the lid on something that he was encouraged from a young age to keep closed. But it's also, it's also about the two of you coming together and building a relationship. So give us the kind of overview of the film without giving too much away, of course. And then I've got some questions for you, because I'm really intrigued to hear more about your relationship with your father.
So I grew up in rural Western Colorado, and I always knew that there was something different about my dad. Over time, as I was a boy, on occasion, these little fragments would leak out at the most unpredictable times. So he would say things like, at the castle where I lived, we worked in the fields all day. And I would think, like, what is he talking about? That's not, he would maybe be trying to tell me a little anecdote about his childhood or something. One time he said, I didn't know how old I was until somebody told me I was 12. I never had a birthday. And then he talked about this castle that was 700 years old where he lived. And I was really baffled by what this meant.
In the absence of context, you're kind of like, okay, castle.
Yeah, I mean, and I would think, well, my friend Nick's dad, grew up in Pennsylvania or something. They had these very accessible, typical backgrounds, and so what he had to share about his childhood didn't make much sense. And over time, I began to realize there was this emptiness feeling inside of me. My dad and I didn't have a particularly close relationship. And I guess I knew, eventually came to know, probably fairly young, that there were a lot of things that I couldn't ask him about because I realized he didn't know the answers. Like, well, I don't know, how do I ask a girl to the 7th grade dance? I knew my dad didn't know about that. I knew he didn't know about going to elementary school. His frame of reference was so unique. And so that really created a distance in our relationship. And it also felt like he was carrying something inside that I didn't understand at all, but I knew it wasn't good. So, this went on for years. I became a teenager, and our relationship got worse, much worse. I was a pretty rebellious kid, and I think I turned into a kind of an angry young man. So, years went by, and I got married and had children of my own, and eventually I realized that there was so much inside that I didn't know what to do with. I actually took my camera, my iPhone, and I went to my dad and I said, why do we never talk about the orphanage in Switzerland? And he said, well, I don't really think there's much to talk about. I don't think there's anything unresolved. And I was like, everything is unresolved. I mean, we don't know why you were there. We don't know who your father was. We never talk about it. And I am sure that had an impact on you. And I think that had an impact on me. And I really think that we should go back to this place and not only talk about it, but see if we can figure out the answer to why were you there? Who was your father? What is the story of what happened? And so my dad agreed, and we bought 2 plane tickets, and I put a camera phone in my pocket, and we went back to Switzerland.
Wow. So before we get into your trip to Switzerland with your dad, let's talk a little bit more about your experience growing up. Do you feel, because like in the beginning of the movie, you open with a monologue that talks about emptiness, that talks about basically just kind of like not knowing where you stand in life and in your relationships. How much of your dad's experience growing up do you feel knocked onto you indirectly or directly, you could say?
I think it impacted me quite a bit. And the older I've become and the more I've dug into this story since returning, the more the impact is becomes clearer to me. If you had asked me when I was 7 or 10 or maybe even 15, I would have said it has very little or no impact. But what I know now is that my dad grew up in an environment where for the first 12 years of his life, when he was in this orphanage, he actually was in 3 orphanages. You see one in the film, but he was in 3, 2 others when he was an infant. There are all sorts of important things that didn't happen for him when he was a boy, and he didn't have parents. Certainly very little expressions of love. I don't think he was touched or held or picked up much. He didn't go to school. Most of the children in this orphanage worked in the fields during the day to gain the sustenance to kind of earn their keep, so to speak. And so there's just no way that background doesn't impact a person. And if those sorts of experiences aren't kind of dealt with and processed and talked about and shared and learned about, there's just no way that doesn't impact the sort of father that you become and husband and man that you become. So I do think all of that impacted him. It probably most significantly was the kind of family culture of not talking about painful things. And so that was, I would say, a habit that got passed down. And of all the single things that had the most impact, I would say that was the most significant.
Yeah, absolutely. At this stage, were you noticing that some of your behaviors were knocking onto your kids?
Yeah, it's interesting because when you ask, was I noticing, there's this, I think there's this phenomenon where we may notice some of these things happening, but it's painful or it's uncomfortable. And I think there's this kind of compulsion to push that stuff out of your awareness, like to not let yourself notice that very long. So in hindsight, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
For sure. I think my kids were seeing, and my wife at the time was seeing a more stoic man. The painful stuff, I think they didn't really see me deal with. I just tried to push it out of my awareness.
There's a lot of talk in my eye group and in men's circles that I've sat in about generational wounds, how that through various experiences from our ancestors, those sometimes, there's been cases like, pretty distant relatives. There have been experiences that have knocked on to the next generation. And then sometimes we're faced with the choice of, well, do we break the cycle of these behaviors, or do we just go along with it because it feels natural? I mean, that's the nurture and nature of how I was raised. So I guess that's my point of reference for parenting. So when I have kids, that's my operating system. So let's get back to the film, because speaking to the film and speaking to this point, I thought it was quite interesting when your father was able to meet one of his old friends from the orphanage in that town, Seb, I believe his name was. And, you know, he shared that there was quite a wedge between him and his son because of the impact of how he was raised in the orphanage and in that system, that he didn't quite have the tools to be the parent he wanted to be. And you could tell how deeply that impacted him. And I'm sure that must have been one of those moments where your dad might have been going, interesting that.
For sure. And I was also in that moment going, wow. I remember when that happened, sitting in the room, and I remember thinking, oh my gosh, it's corroborated. You know, there's some validity to my experience. And I think also my dad's experience, to say that it seems so obvious in hindsight. Yeah, growing up in an orphanage is not an ideal place for a child. But there's something I think about when you've experienced something and it hasn't been acknowledged or validated. You might know that intellectually, but to hear somebody else say, yes, I was a man that grew up in this orphanage and my relationship with my son has been difficult, it became real. I mean, it really turned it into something legitimate. And it's, you know, that's not a happy fact or a positive thing, but it's the truth. And I feel like the process of that trip really, as the truth became more apparent and more known, it gave us a place to stand in that truth and start from.
Absolutely. And, you know, the film, we get to witness your dad cop all of this new information head on, right? For the longest time, his operating system was, well, you know, there's nothing to really talk about. I only know what I know from the age of 12, and there's nothing really else. Because your grandmother, who had him come to America, right? Your grandmother was living in the United States when he was in the orphanage. She called for her son to come to America. And when he was asking about who's my father, she said, don't even go there. Like, don't even ask. You have a stepfather. He's your father. Don't even ask. So no wonder your dad was, you know, just had such a tight lid on all of that. And in the film, we really witness him just confronting all of this information that possibly even the smallest part of his consciousness over his 67 years up into that point, that loop was always open for him.
Yeah.
Like, who is my father? And so it was touching to see him get emotional and to see him, you know, there's a scene where he wakes up in the middle of the night, almost as if it had all been a dream, like confronting all of this. It was like, you know, it almost threw him into a different psychological state of like, is this actually happening right now? I feel like I'm dreaming all of this. And are we in Switzerland right now? Like, it was just amazing to see the impact of all those years of shoving it down, hiding it, repressing it, denying these questions that have been inside of him, to have them, you know, some of them being answered right in front of him, and how it was hitting him. I mean, was he the kind of man, did you ever see him show many emotions or a range of emotions growing up, or was he kind of a more stoic?
He was an emotional person, but it's as though there was a black hole around this very important subject, which, or maybe kind of multiple family. There was not emotion around family. There wasn't a close family feel, and that was between my dad and I, and also, as you mentioned, you know, I knew my grandmother. She had sent for him when he was 12, and there wasn't a close relationship there. So there wasn't a lot of emotional expression in the family. And then about his childhood, there wasn't much that came from him around that. And I remember thinking at some young age, when I realized what an orphanage is, I remember thinking, like, that seems sad to me. I mean, being in an orphanage seems sad. If I were in an orphanage, I think I would be pretty sad about it. I wouldn't know my parents. Why isn't my dad sad? And then, as I would think that through again at a young age, a little deeper, I thought, well, there must be something wrong with me that I think that's sad when he doesn't. And there must be something wrong with me about how I'm thinking about this whole thing, because I'm the only one.
Right. Because he's your primary role model, right? As a male. And that his wounds become your wounds at that point, right? There's a knock-on effect there. So, we're very conscious not to give away too much for the film. It's one of the most beautiful films I think I've ever watched of this genre, right? This kind of like documentary kind of style, and it had me hooked at every single stage. I want to ask you, we were connected through Jim White, so someone who's been in the Mankind Project for a while. You've been sitting in a circle in Colorado for a while now. Ever since your father has found out about some of his origins and reconnected with a lot of it and reopened a lot of that part of his life, has he continued work around kind of unpacking some of those traumas, some of those wounds, and gotten in touch with a lot of those things? Because gosh, he was 67 in the film, but he must be 78 now. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. He just had a birthday. He's 78. Yeah.
Yeah. So how's his journey been ever since kind of finally choosing to look at those shadows, choosing to look at those wounds?
It's been incredible. It's been nothing short of incredible. I'm aware that a lot of times when we talk about the origins of this story, it can feel pretty heavy. I mean, I feel heavy sometimes just kind of talking about the beginnings of it. It's sad, but boy, does it end or has it progressed to a really amazing place, filled with so much joy and deepening understanding. So much has happened from returning from this trip, because, of course, what we discover is quite amazing and hugely transformative just in those moments when you see it happen, when it happened right in front of us. But something else really powerful has kind of continued ever since that moment, and it's the sharing of this story with other people. We've traveled all over the country. We've shared it at events, at film festivals, with organizations. And in doing that, I can't tell you how many people we have come up, many different people. My dad has had other adoptees come up and say, I know exactly how you feel. And it's totally normal to feel that way. I felt that way too. We've had women who had to relinquish children who've shared their perspective, and that's really filled in a piece of the puzzle. And then I often have sons who have had distant relationships with their fathers come up and talk about feeling similarly. And so the value in talking about that painful stuff has been to realize that you're not the only one. I might be the only one with that particular father and that particular orphanage and that sort of a thing. But it turns out there's a lot of shared experience in these painful stories. And it's so healing to talk about that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I like the distinction you made there, because I've sat in circles with men that, they grew up with their fathers. They've known, dad's always been a 15-minute drive away or a phone call away, but they'll still say, I've never known my father. Right? So the title of the film, Father Unknown, I'm sure can relate to so many outside of, whether you actually know the identity of your biological parents or not. And so you've just shared about his journey, his experience of continuing to talk about this. I'm sure there's very much a therapeutic part of this to him, being actually able to talk about his story with you as you go to these various film, these film festivals. And how has your relationship with your father changed since 2009? Because this film wasn't just you being able to be a director from an objective lens.
Right. That's right.
Surprised the
not
camera
at all.
I'm surprised the camera didn't shake more while you were filming these things, because you were getting these revelations just as he was. So
yeah.
How has the relationship between the two of you progressed in the 10, 11, 12 years since?
It's I didn't think it was possible. And if you had told me when I was that angry teenager that I described earlier, that it would be possible to have a closeness with my father, and then I would grow up and make a heartwarming father-son film, and it would be about me and my dad, I would have said, that is the last thing that ever could possibly happen. But our relationship has it's transformed profoundly. We're super close. I think you've maybe heard he's texted me a couple of times while you and I are having this conversation. We talk every day or every other day, and I really feel like he was a father unknown to me, but boy, have we've done so much to transform that. And I really do feel like I know my father. I feel like he knows me. That wasn't easy, because some of the stuff that wasn't known can be difficult to hear or painful to talk about or uncomfortable. Yeah. But the byproduct of having those conversations is a closer relationship, and that's just priceless.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, how has your relationship with your kids changed since going through this experience?
That's a great question. My kids and I are closer than ever before. I have 3 kids. They're all, I guess, I still have officially one teenager who's 19, but my other 2 are in their early 20s. We've become closer too. I think that my kids won't grow up wondering, why is my dad the way he is? They still may wonder that to some degree, but I think in terms of the kind of that big question, what are the things that impacted my dad and has maybe shaped who he became, they've had answers to that. And not only just for me, just for their father, but also for their grandfather. And so this topic has really been explored in our family, and it continues to be. It's an ongoing process. And I don't think it magically solves all of the problems. I mean, it doesn't make a fairy tale family.
Happily ever after, right?
Yeah, I mean, we're still in the present. It's still, there's still work to be done, and difficult conversations, I'm sure, will come in the future. But it takes this large, unspoken kind of question off of the table, and I think helps kind of move everybody into the present. And that's been a big plus for my relationship with my kids. And we'd really have to ask them, but I think they would say that they have the opportunity to know what really was going on with their dad and what is going on with their dad. And I feel more known. And that's being known is what makes us feel closer, I think.
Well, before we went live, we checked in with one another, and I checked in with sadness because this film kicked up a lot of emotion for me, being a world away from my parents and missing my father, and just what you just said there, feeling known to my kids, I think is to me it's almost to say, like, not to be universally accepted, acquitted, or it's just to be known, right? To give a frame of reference. When my dad and I were at odds when I was growing up, and we were able to reconnect, especially in a big way after I got involved in the Mankind Project, I was able to gain so much insight into his upbringing that those penny drop moments were just so abundant of, oh, wow. Whatever age he was at the time, 50 something, I went, this thing that happened when he was 12 relates to why he behaves this way today. It gives me room to be so much more compassionate to my father, even when he's driving me nuts. To be able just to be able to go, like, you know what, that's, his upbringing had a huge impact on that.
Yeah.
And all of us, right? It comes back to nurture and nature, what environment we were raised in and who raised us in that environment. And so I want to ask you, David, this film's been out for how many years now?
We just completed it in 2020.
Wow.
We've had versions of the film kind of along the way.
Yeah.
But what my producing partner and I realized is that if there's a way we can tell this story better, if there's a way we can sharpen the storytelling and the point,
yeah,
we'll change it. And so we've worked on it for years, but we finally have it in a state that we feel is the best we can do with footage recorded on an iPhone. So.
Sure. Yeah. Well, mate, it's already won a bunch of awards, and I guess my final question for you is, what have been some cool anecdotes, or what is an anecdote that speaks to the impact this film is already having on people? And the other side of that is, what hope do you have for its continued impact going forward now that it's out there and the story is there for people to hear it?
A lot of times at our screening events, when they happen in person, I'll see, I think I mentioned this to you previously when we were talking, I'll see people in the audience coming before the film starts. Sometimes I can kind of get a sense that, a woman has dragged her partner, her husband, maybe her brother to see this film. And I can kind of tell from his posture, like he might be sitting in the audience like this and just not look particularly enthusiastic about being there.
Sure. We've all seen the bloke with his arms crossed.
Yeah. What is this going to be kind of a thing? And often it's that same man who comes up after the film to share something with my dad or with me about a similar experience. And so that's such a meaningful thing for us to be able to share our story and have it inspire someone else to, as you mentioned, to call your dad or to have a difficult conversation with someone you love. And it's also inspired a lot of adoptees and first parents to really take a big risk and try and solve the mystery of maybe their own origins. And so, like I said before, to make a film that was about disconnection, and one that I experienced in a pretty profound way, and I think my dad as well, to make a film like that then encourages people to connect is a huge surprise, and also really personally so healing to just see that happen for other people.
And is that your continued hope that it's going to keep having that impact?
Yeah, I mean, especially for men, I guess I have a, I have a, of course, I wish that for everybody, but I think men in particular, we may be predisposed to pushing a lot of the painful stuff down, whether it's nature or nurture in terms of being kind of taught to do that. And if this story can be an encouragement to explore some of that stuff by showing what can be gained by doing it. I mean, I wouldn't say to anybody, well, you should just dig through that painful stuff because that's what people tell you to do. I would say there's real value and significant upside in bravely sort of asking those questions. You really can gain things that are meaningful that you will be happy about having done. So it's not psychobabble sort of a process. It's something that I think really can be meaningful and worthwhile to people in their own estimation at the end of having done it.
Well, mate, like I said in the beginning, tears in my eyes all throughout the movie. Watching it, it is absolutely beautiful to see the not just the the drama element. Gosh, it makes a good movie for that alone, right? It does keep you on the edge. It does keep you on the edge of your seat. So the movie does a good job on that front. But on the watching the two of you connect, watching his journey through the unpacking of who he is, right? His story, where he's come from. And to now know the impact that this film is having on so many, mate, I'm so glad that you decided to pull out your camera phone on this that the two of you had, because this is a great example of those, how personal journeys can create ripple effects for so many others, not just for you personally, not just for your family, but now it's knocking on to countless lives as well. So for those listening, whether live right now on the Facebook page or via the podcast, you can head to fatherunknown.com to find out details about the movie, about the film. If you want to host a screening, if you want to get in touch with David, continue to promote the word, you can both purchase it and rent it. David, any final comments, mate, before we wrap up?
Thanks for having me and for having this conversation. I think it's very meaningful for men in particular to have conversations like this. So thank you.
Mate, couldn't agree more. Thank you for reaching out. For those of you listening, just to give you a bit of an insight as to how conversations like this come together, I recently interviewed another filmmaker, Alex Gabby, about his film Beyond Men and Masculinities. And that episode went out on the podcast. It went live on the Facebook page, and someone who knew David and was a link between us introduced us. So if you guys have incredible stories out there, people who you know have been through some pretty interesting experiences in life that can lend some insights for fellow listeners and can continue these ripple effects, please don't ever hesitate to reach out. But for those of you that have joined us live, thank you so much for your comments. Thank you for your giveaway. Thank you for being here. Thank you for checking in for another live recording of the Mankind Podcast, the show where we break the molds of modern manhood to prove that there is more than just one way to be a man. Lots of love, guys, and we'll see you very soon. Well, I don't know how you're feeling after that one, but I can tell you what, one of the first things I did after that was have a conversation with my father. And I am just so grateful that I get to be in this work with my dad and that he introduced me to this work. And so my hope for all of you out there after listening to this episode is, even if you may not be able to have a physical conversation with your father or any of your parents, just know that the healing really starts with self. And perhaps share a little compassion and awareness and maybe some deeper understanding as to why your folks are the way they are. And so for those of you that want to find out more about Father Unknown, head to fatherunknown.com. And here for you, we have a little trailer for the movie to get you a little pepped up to go ahead and download it. Enjoy.
It's been this way for as long as I can remember. I've tried to act like I don't feel it inside, but I can't escape the emptiness. I've become a man, a husband, and a father. But the past consumes me, and I am obsessed with the fragments of a story about my father. There was a castle, rows of beds. There was a boy named Urban. A letter from a woman he had never met. His mother. The past has never been spoken about, and there's always been a distance between me and my father. There is something hidden in the silence.
I'm trying to get some information about a person who lived in this little village in 1941.
Oh, wait a minute. Where am I?
Here in Switzerland.
How did I get over here? You and I are traveling together.
We've been trying to figure out who your father is. I don't know what happened.
Maybe you better just come back home. That's the end of it.
You know, there's been a lot of changes for him.
I just thought it was all good. What is that? It's gonna be good, Dad.
This has been the Mankind Podcast, produced in association with the Mankind Project USA. I have been your host, Brandon Clift, and I personally want to thank our guests for joining us today and imparting their wisdom from their experiences in this amazing journey called life. And of course, I want to thank you, the listener, because through your attention and your support, you make it a heck of a lot easier for us to let men out there in the world know that they are not alone and that there is more than one way to be a man. Special thanks, of course, goes to my incredible team, Marketing and Communications Director Boyson Hodgson, producer and editor of this episode, Michael Russo, who makes me sound so much more intelligent than I actually am, so of course, special kudos goes there. And if you've been enjoying the music throughout this episode and all of our episodes, check out Jim, Donovan, and the Sun King Warriors. I have links to them in the show notes. Now, the fee for this episode is simple. If you found gold and insights that you believe could benefit your loved ones and those you care about, be sure to share it with them. And of course, remember that life doesn't happen to us, it happens for us, so long as we rip the pen out of fate's hand and become the author of our own story. So my friend, pick up the pen and we'll see you next week. Lots of love.